Hello, I'm Rick Sinding. It's Tuesday, November 13th, 2018, here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics on the campus of Rutgers University. With me today for the Center on the American Governor is Maggie Moran, whose career as a political and campaign operative spans more than 2 decades, from the re-election campaign for U.S. President Bill Clinton in 1996 up to and including the re-election campaign of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. Everybody seems to make that mistake. Andrew Cuomo earlier this month. Our focus today, primarily but not exclusively, will be on Maggie's involvement with former New Jersey Governor Jon Corzine. First in working for his campaign, then working in his state office, and ultimately taking a role in his administration as Deputy Chief of Staff and Director of the Office of Management and Budget. Maggie, normally I'd say welcome to Eagleton, but you spent more time here than I have over the past several years.
It's like a second home for me.
Teaching a course. And
yes.
So instead of saying welcome to Eagleton, thank you very much for sitting down with us
I'm glad
today.
to be here.
Let's start by finding a little bit about you. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? How did you get involved in government politics campaigns?
Sure. Well, I grew up in New York in Westchester County. I lived in a variety of different towns in Westchester. My mom had been married and divorced a couple of times, and so we lived with my grandmother for a period of time. We lived in very wealthy parts of Westchester and very poor parts of Westchester. So as a child,
there are poor parts of
yeah,
Westchester?
I mean Greenburgh Central 7. I think that the student population back then, you could definitely tell there were people in trouble, and with low incomes and didn't have access. And I think I got to see some of the feminization of poverty as a kid. I don't think I was cognizant of it the way I am today, or how I was educated at Douglas College at Rutgers, but. But I certainly, it was impressed upon me, access to health care was fleeting for us at certain times of our lives. Having financial stability was fleeting for us in many different times of our lives when I was little. Mm-hmm. And so I think as a result of those experiences, I think I was constantly aware of sort of the issues that are necessary in public policy, but I certainly was not a political family by any stretch. I attended Rutgers because of a series of factors. I admired the school from afar. It was within 2.5 hours of my grandmother's home, who at the time was sick, and so I wanted to be close to home. And I was very enamored by Douglas College and the commitment to women's leadership. So luckily for me, I got into Douglas College, and the first sort of moment I ever thought about politics was on this campus, on the lawn outside. It was 1992, and Geraldine Ferraro was speaking on behalf of Bill Clinton, who was running for president. I was walking by, not attending the rally. I had thought I wanted to be undergraduate. Mm-hmm. Yep, my first year. I thought I wanted to be a newscaster, so I was going to major in journalism. I stopped, I listened to her speech, and I decided I wanted to be a part of making the news, not reporting the news. I probably switched my major within 3 weeks, and then I spent a remarkable amount of time here at Eagleton and got tremendous exposure through the Center for the American Women in Politics, through Ruth Mandel and Debbie Walsh, and all of the extraordinary faculty and staff here, and caught the bug, without question, caught the bug.
And went right to work in 1996 for Bill Clinton's re-election campaign.
Ironically enough, the person who helped me find my way into politics was a professor at Rutgers named Tom Hartman, who has since passed away.
A very dear and old friend of mine.
I was a huge admirer of Tom's, and he brought me to the Rusty Scupper in Princeton for lunch back then when it was open. It's something else now.
Yeah,
and I did not know.
3 or 4 other things since then.
I did not know it was almost going to be a job interview. He wanted to introduce me to Tom Byrne, the governor's son. He wanted to introduce me to Senator Torricelli's staff as well as to President Clinton's staff to see if I wanted to work on a campaign. I had thought I wanted to be involved in the policy side of the house.
How had you gotten to know Tom?
I took his class, and I became a favored nation status. I was always very, very close to the faculty. Michael Schaefer was another extraordinary. I admired him. Susan Lawrence, Susan Carroll. There's a ton of professors at Rutgers that I just fell in love with, and Tom was one of them. And actually, the first class I ever taught at Rutgers, I was 25 years old, and I taught Tom's class for 2 years in the Department of Journalism, which we always thought was a hoot, but it was he was the one who really introduced me to politics.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
Tom and I just by way of introduction between us, Tom and I and Ray Bateman used to do the post-election wrap-up for the Rutgers University Forum every year.
Yeah.
Tom was a dear friend.
He's a wonderful
and I
man.
can understand why he was a mentor to you.
Yes.
So what did you do in the Clinton campaign?
So it's ironic. I first started out as the assistant to the chairman, state chairman Tom Byrne at the time, and it was a very small staff, and was post-Florio years, so the Democratic Party was in a rebuilding exercise. Obviously, this was '96, not '92, but within 3 weeks of working for Tom Byrne, the coordinated campaign, which is the party apparatus to get all Democrats elected, was sort of standing itself up, and they put me in a room and said, "Would you be interested in running Rapid Response?" And it's a pretty funny story, because my reaction was, absolutely, that's great. Yeah, when do I get started?
Did you know what Rapid Response was?
I had no idea. I remember I left the room and said to Patty McGuire, who's one of my dearest friends and a great mentor of mine, I said, Patty, you got to explain to me what this job is. I have no idea what it is. And it was a crazy job. I mean, I remember saying to my mother 3 or 4 weeks after I had taken the job, Mom, I'm going to be on TV tonight. And she was like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, Bob Dole's coming into Milltown, New Jersey, just a few miles down the road. He's going to do a big event with Governor Whitman. And our job is to make sure that the negative narrative, the contrast message that New Jersey voters wouldn't like, would be in that story. And so what we did was we focused on his close affinity for the tobacco industry and his lack of interest in sensible gun control. And I actually appeared as a 8-foot cigarette as part of a prop on the stage, to which my mother said, I'm not sure that you went to college to do this. What is Rapid Response? Maybe you should have a new profession. But it was a lot of fun. And at that point, Bill Clinton's candidacy was really important in New Jersey, because '92 he had won the state. But it was the first year that we really started to show that we were becoming a blue state as it related to presidential elections. Mm-hmm. So they spent a lot of time here. They spent a lot of money here. They had very senior top talent here, and it was a really exciting year. The Torricelli race was extremely aggressive. Fairly controversial. There was a lot of intensity back then.
Mm-hmm. So you moved on. What did you do immediately after that? Because the next thing I know that you did politically was to work on Al Gore's campaign in 2000. But what did you do?
No, so in 1997, I was the political director of the Democratic Party under Jim McGreevey when he ran the first time, which was what I call sort of the heart campaign. We didn't have the money that everybody else had. We were sort of the surprise candidacy of the year. Folks really didn't think that McGreevey was going to get as close as he did to Whitman. It was probably one of the most devastating losses I've ever experienced in politics, because when you lose an election that, is by 30,000 votes or some number that is a field-driven problem, you could have fixed it. It was really, really difficult. But one of the things that I learned rather quickly was you learn so much more in politics when you lose than when you win.
Absolutely. One of the great, that's why I always told reporters, go to the losing candidate's headquarters, not the winning candidate's
and you'll
headquarters.
Learn a lot
There's
more.
much bigger story there.
And then after I was political director at the party, Senator Lautenberg's longtime state director, Christy Davis, was retiring or switching to a different part of her chapter in her professional life. And I went down to meet with Senator Lautenberg about his state director position. It was one of the funniest, most intriguing days of my life. I remember parking in D.C. I hadn't spent much time in D.C. It's obviously a fairly intimidating place. It's pretty overwhelming. Frank Lautenberg loved eagles, so he had these sort of 8-foot high eagles in his office that were really cool, but a little strange, right? And certainly intimidating. And our interview lasted the entire day. So I got there at about 11 o'clock for an interview. I didn't leave till 4. I think it's safe to say we sort of fell in love with each other. We had a really great time. I remember he asked me how old I was, and I told him that was an illegal question in a job interview. The truth was I didn't want to tell him I was only 22, 23 years old, because who would hire a 23-year-old to be their New Jersey chief of staff? That would be unimaginable. And teased him that the voters were going to ask about his age when he ran for re-election, and that we probably ought to get that squared away.
You could have given the great Ronald Reagan answer of, I won't talk about how young you are.
My youth and indiscretion of my opponent. And so we really had a nice time together, and I loved working for Frank. I worked for him for 2 years, and he was planning on running for re-election when I went to work for him. That's why he wanted somebody who was more political and much more grounded in the politics of the state. The joke about Frank Lautenberg was he was a great Democrat once every 6 years, and that happened to be the year he was up for election, which isn't exactly fair, but that's what John Adler used to say about him. And so when I was working for Lautenberg, obviously, I got to know a series of party players, and nationally and locally, and he was the one who really encouraged me to do the Gore race since he wasn't running.
And now you were in the state office
I was,
for Lautenberg? This is Newark?
I managed the Newark, the state operation,
Now explain, because I think a lot of the viewers or those who are reading the transcript of this won't know exactly what the difference is between the office in Washington and what the state office is responsible for. What were your responsibilities as the state director?
The state director is really critical. I mean, first and foremost, great policy makes great politics, right? So Lautenberg was just a tremendously fierce legislative warrior. He took on big battles that weren't popular when he started them. He was fearless when he had an opinion, and as progressive as they come, certainly in that day and age. And so our job was either to take a problem that was happening in New Jersey and translate it to the Washington staff to see if they can come up with a policy that would help impact positively the residents of New Jersey. It was to defend New Jersey. Back then, the pharmaceutical industry had a massive presence, and so we were constantly advocating for that community. We're a densely populated state, we're a diverse state, so the senator was very, very aggressive on those kinds of issues, on the energy, on the environment. Our job was to translate everything he was doing in Washington in state and to continue to maintain significant relationships with every stakeholder and keep a value proposition between the leadership of the state, including not-for-profits and community groups and the senator's offices, to just sort of stay up to date. The other big thing we had to do was to define the senator's role in Washington daily, right, with the press corps. And then, of course, the direct interaction from a constituent basis, which the senator took very, very seriously, right? If he was going to nominate someone to a Naval Academy, he was going to meet that young person. He was going to make sure that they were the right candidate. Nominating judges for the bench, we had a whole recruitment process for the judicial process. Senator Lautenberg was very active in diversifying the bench, both in terms of gender and race. He was Frank Lautenberg was a really honorable guy.
Let's move back to the 1977 gubernatorial campaign for a minute. Were you involved in McGreevy's primary, or did you come on to his campaign in the general election?
Well, technically, I was a political director of the state party, so we technically were not supposed to be involved in the primary as much. But I stayed on as political director for the McGreevy race itself. He and I got to know each other very well then. And when 2001, when he ran for governor, I ran his coordinated campaign, which back then was a very big deal. We spent $25 million while he could only spend $9 million because he was taking public financing. So the coordinated campaign, which was responsible both for tying the state Senate that year, taking back the Assembly, and electing Jim McGreevy governor, was really driven by the state party coordinated campaign operation, of which we had countless resources.
It's sort of an early version of a supportive PAC.
Yes, it is. I mean, and back then, and I would argue today that we're doing this totally wrong. I would argue that we should allow the parties to take a lot of money, have complete transparency about who donates, instead of these sort of secret PACs today where you don't know what they're coming from or who they're taking their money from and what kind of impact they're having or what real agenda they have. I would argue the way we used to do it makes a lot more sense for the public and for transparency than the way we do it today, for sure.
What about, we could talk a lot just about the role of money altogether in campaigns today and whether that should be limited in some fashion. I'm interested in the 97 race because I don't think in any of the interviews that we've done here we've talked a lot about that particular primary.
Yes.
Where my recollection is that Rob Andrews, who was the congressman for the 1st District in South Jersey, was widely favored to win that primary.
Yes.
And Jim McGreevy really came out of nowhere and won it.
Rob Andrews,
what's your recollection of how that happened?
Rob Andrews was very clever in the sense that if you're a South Jersey candidate in a statewide race, you sort of have the 7 southern counties, which usually is about 20 to 23% of the primary. So unless you get 1 or 2 counties in the north, you really have a difficult time as a South Jersey candidate running statewide.
Unless there are a whole bunch of candidates running in the north who will break that
True,
up.
but Rob Andrews at the time had Hudson County, which was very, very unusual that Hudson County would actually support a South Jersey candidate in a primary where you had a candidate from Middlesex.
Then
very
if you have
unusual.
Hudson County and the 7 South Jersey counties, how do you lose?
How do you lose? Well, I think the reality was that Jim McGreevy was just a remarkable grassroots politician. He built up a true grassroots coalition with African Americans, Latinos, and labor. Jim McGreevy is the first governor of New Jersey, I think, who empowered the labor community in a way that was unheard of previously to Jim McGreevy's governorship. I mean, he met with every international president, every local labor leader. He knew everybody's family members' names. He knew everything about the actual people and loved, you could just see it, loved people. Rob Andrews was very, very smart, but was also a bit more conservative. As we know, candidates that come out of the South tend to have a more conservative, sort of blue dog Democrat view rather than coming out of what I would say Jim McGreevy was more of a Reagan Democrat with a little bit of a linkage to the progressive side, and so as a result, he just, I think, fit the issues better of where the turnout of the election was coming. But without question, Essex County ended up being a savior for Jim McGreevy, both in 2001 when Bob Torselli thought about primarying him for the governor's race, and it certainly was a big deal for him in 1997.
All right, so 2001, no, wait a minute, where are we now?
So 2000 I did Gore, and that's when I met John Corzine.
Okay, now, this was running the co-campaign in New Jersey.
So I ran the Al Gore-Lieberman campaign in New Jersey, and because Al Gore was performing so well in New Jersey, we had always been leading in the polls, The only time the vice president came was really to raise resources, right, which everybody's very familiar with in New Jersey. And what that meant was that every single program that happened, Essex County Democratic Party, the AFL-CIO convention, I would go and speak on behalf of Al Gore, and John Corzine would go speak on behalf of John Corzine in his campaign to win the U.S. Senate seat.
I see.
So we were sat on a dais together. I would say, I mean, it was insane. At one point, he and I were counting and joking around about it, but it was like 50 to 70 different days in a row where we were on the same platform at some event. And I ended up sort of taking a lot of political risk by really spending a lot of time thinking about how the Gore campaign could really assist John Corzine, because as you remember, that race with Bob Franks was quite close. And a lot of people believe that if that race had extended another week, that the Corzine candidacy may not have survived it. We had a momentum issue at the end. It was almost as if the spend was so significant, people were so exhausted with the TV ads. And Bob Franks and John Corzine, who were great personal friends and went to the same church in Summit and had a really close personal relationship and was a great advisor to the governor when Bob Franks was still alive, when John was governor and senator. I spent a lot of time having the Gore apparatus focus on the Corzine Senate seat.
So all right, so you are already kind of shifting over from running the Gore campaign to being a part of the Corzine campaign.
It's ironic, yeah. We really got to know each other through that process. But I had already committed to Jim McGreevey that I would run his Democratic coordinated campaign in 2001. So John Corzine and I had dinner towards the end of his Senate race, and he wanted me to come work for him. And I said, I'm really sorry. I've already committed to Jim McGreevey that I'm going to run his coordinated campaign. And so, ironically, as we kept talking through the year I was running Jim McGreevey's race, I always had a fondness for John, and I thought he was an extraordinary human being. I still do. And he had said to me, well, do you think you're going to go to Trenton if McGreevey wins? And I said, I don't really know about that. I have to think about that. All of my friends were going to Trenton, obviously. Everybody was very excited about it, sort of take back power in Trenton with Jim McGreevey as governor. Jim McGreevey and I get along great today, but back then I didn't think women had enough influence at his table. And one of the reasons why I decided ultimately to go work for John Corzine and be his state director in 2002 and not go to Trenton was I thought I could have a much bigger impact on the policy and the politics of John Corzine's future and what he planned to do in a more significant way than I could with Governor McGreevey.
You also had experience having worked for running Lautenberg State Office,
yes.
Working at the federal level.
Yes.
That would have been your entry into state level
yes.
politics. Was that a consideration
it
as
was.
well?
I'm one of those people who actually loves campaigns and government, and I love management. So I, for me, a lot of my friends either love politics or government, right? They don't see. There's very few people who seem to love both. I really thought it was important. I always joke around about this with particularly younger people who say, politics is dirty or it can be negative. And I say, look, you have to get elected in order to govern. So you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And then once you get there, you have to deliver for the people that you just promised that you're going to change their lives and get their heads above water and do the kinds of policy things that can make their life even just a little bit better. So I definitely knew that at some point I wanted to work in state government. And remember, I was still pretty young at that point. So I'm in my late 20s, I guess, at that point. I had just all these remarkable opportunities at a very young age, and so I was excited to work with Corzine because it was a blank canvas that we could paint for him. Right? The most important job I had as his state director, I would argue, in the first year or two, was to change the byline of John Corzine. What I mean by that, it used to be John Corzine, comma, who bought his U.S. Senate seat, comma. Our job was to turn it into John Corzine, comma, an expert in financial services while we're regulating the industry and the advocate of the right to know bill, comma. That was our most significant objective in those first 2 years from a positioning sort of standpoint. And then obviously, John Corzine was an extraordinary Democrat, extremely generous, would show up anywhere, anytime for any candidate, whether it was a school board member or a city council race or a legislator or a freeholder. He was just an unbelievably good Democrat. And so we had great politics. He would never say no. I mean, this is a man who would do 12 to 15 events a day on a weekend if we asked him to, without even blinking about it, no hesitation about it.
How much of a personal relationship did you develop with him over this period?
A ton.
You're in Newark, he's in Washington.
Yeah, but he was a great home state senator, right? I mean, he came back and forth constantly. He would come back on a weeknight if we thought the event was important enough, and then fly right back down or take the train right back down. Every weekend he would work. I mean, John Corzine does not fear work. He embraces work. We used to joke in the office, whether it was senator or governor, that most normal people go on vacation, they want to go away, like 7 to 12 days. John Corzine would take 3 days and come back like the Energizer Bunny, and we'd be all like, oh my God. I mean, the guy had relentless, boundless energy, and was just never afraid of work.
At what point do you think he began to think about wanting to be governor?
Look, I think John Corzine was and is a very ambitious man, and I mean that in a positive sense. He is a massive risk taker. It's something people really don't understand about him. So I think it was always in his mind. What role can I play in an executive level, right? I think the other thing to think about too is the culture from which he came. First of all, he's got these really nice Midwest values, right? So he's a little different than us in Jersey and New York with the sort of chip on our shoulders and our aggressiveness. He just has a different way about him, right? He really does care about people, and he's a very genuine guy. Second to that, he goes to Goldman and runs this massive organization that takes remarkable resiliency and intellect, takes the company public, which others had tried and failed to do many times before. And at Goldman, there is a dedication to public service, right? Whether it's Paulson or Rubin or Cohn or Corzine, you are told at Goldman with much responsibility, right? With much, what's that saying? John used to say it all the time. With much, if you're given a lot in life, you have responsibilities. And his issue was, I want to serve, right? So I think he had always thought about potentially being a governor or secretary of the Treasury, or what's the the highest level I could serve to have the broadest impact. And I mean that in a positive way, but a very ambitious guy. I think it was always in the backs of our minds.
Why governor of New Jersey as opposed to United States senator? There are certain personalities that
Yes.
love being senators,
Yes.
and there are certain personalities that really want to be governors
Yes.
and ultimately president. What is it, do you think, in his DNA that caused him to want to make that
John
transition?
Corzine gets his hands dirty. I mean, he's not somebody who, sits back and pontificates like the United States Senate really often enjoys doing it. I mean, you literally could never pass a bill in the United States Senate and get reelected as a senator in New Jersey if you really do the right press conferences and advocate for the right issues. It doesn't mean you're actually making progress, right? So I think from his perspective, anything that would put more responsibility on him to deliver outcomes and impacts for people was something that he would relish the opportunity to do. And the morning that I had to call him to let him know that Jim McGreevey was going to do a press conference at noon that day was probably one of the most fascinating days of my life. I was pregnant. I remember that. My phone started ringing at 4 o'clock. I was pregnant. My phone started ringing about. By the way, I was pregnant because my husband and I luckily had planned, right, to have a baby during that time because John Corzine's election for U.S. Senate, it was a governor's race. We were not planning on running, obviously, because Jim McGreevey was going to run for re-election, so we thought, 2005. Our race was going to be in 2006. So I was pregnant to have a baby because the timing of that worked out really well.
The race in 2006 would have been his Senate re-election.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So this was a great year to have a baby, 2004. So we thought, or at least that's how it worked. So long story short, I start getting calls at 4 o'clock in the morning with this rumor mill saying that Jim McGreevey is going to step down today and this is what's going to happen. Corzine, at the time, was the chairman of the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee, which is you get elected by your colleagues and your job is to raise resources to help Senate Democrats win all across the country. It's actually how he met Barack Obama and endorsed him in the primary while he was DSCC chairman, which was very unusual to endorse in a primary. But long story short, I called him. He was in Puerto Rico. He picked up the phone. It was rather early in the morning, obviously. He thought somebody had died. I said to him, Senator, you might want to grab a cup of coffee and take a shower and give me a buzz back. And he said, well, just tell me. And I said, well, you might want to just grab a cup of coffee and call me back and freshen up a little bit. It was super early in the morning. He said, just tell me. I said, Governor McGreevey's gay. He's coming out today. He's going to also admit he had an extramarital affair with the Director of Homeland Security, and he potentially is going to be stepping down. And John said, you know what, I'm going to hang up, go take a shower, grab a cup of coffee. And then he said, I assume you're calling. I said, my phone is ringing off the hook. You should come home. You should come home right now because we need to start talking about this.
Your phone is ringing off the hook because people are already beginning to say, is Corzine going to now run for governor now that McGreevey has stepped down?
We had built a ton of political goodwill with the county leadership, with organized labor. John was an unapologetic progressive, so he was really loved by the core of the Democratic Party, the true progressive core. The party leadership loved him because he was so generous to the counties and always helped candidates. Obviously, when you have something like this shake the Democratic Party, will the Republicans have an opportunity to run somebody and take the seat back, which folks were very, very worried about. So ultimately, the idea that he could self-finance was very compelling. And there was a big debate, and it started immediately that morning of whether Dick Cody or John Corzine would be the nominee of the Democratic Party.
Well, and this brings us, I think, to the most fascinating part of, brings us to a fascinating part of the transition And we'll get to that
Yes.
after we talk about the 2005 campaign.
Yes.
Okay. Corzine is the Democratic nominee.
Yes.
The Republican nominee is Doug Forrester,
Yes.
who had run against Frank Lautenberg in 2002. Corzine had succeeded Lautenberg in 2000.
Yes.
Then Lautenberg comes out of retirement
Yes.
and runs against and runs against Forrester. And now you were in a campaign running against Forrester.
Yes, and I forgot one tidbit. In the 30-day campaign of Frank Lautenberg, Patty McGuire and I went over and ran the campaign. And so I was in the car with Frank Lautenberg every single day for 30 days of that campaign against Forrester. So I had seen
This is after the Supreme Court had allowed his
Yes.
name to be put onto the ballot?
Exactly right.
Okay.
Angelo Genova's incredible performance in front of the Supreme Court, which was just magnificent. But
For people who aren't familiar with that, why don't you take us through what happened there when Torricelli decided
so
not to run?
Torricelli decides that he's not going to run. Governor McGreevey at the time calls a meeting at Drumthwacket of John Corzine and his senior staff, myself and Tom Shea at the time, and his entire senior staff. And we're sitting around this big dining room table in the, what is the living room of Drumthwacket, and the governor is going through the potential candidates that could run, right? Who can win with 30 days? Who has the name ID? Who has the political infrastructure? Who has the resources? So they had asked Frank Pallone, for example, first, and Frank Pallone declined, thinking that it was a short time frame. They talked through another of other Congress members, and one of the things that Senator Torricelli had asked, as I understand it, was for his replacement not to be Frank Lautenberg, anybody but Frank.
There was no love lost between the two of them.
That's exactly right. They did not have a close relationship.
Yes.
And John Corzine and I argued fairly passionately that Frank Lautenberg was the obvious choice, and that as he hadn't enjoyed retirement, the only reason he didn't run for re-election was because of fundraising. It wasn't because of age or stamina. He loved the United States Senate. He was a huge supporter of that institution, of all of its sort of glory and significance. And so John Corzine and I called Frank and asked to see him at 7 o'clock the next morning, and drove up north and recruited him to run. And part of that deal was the following. Jim McGreevey sent Kevin Hagan to the campaign. John Corzine sent me and Patty McGuire to the campaign. I had my job. I had to commit to being in the car for those 30 days because, Frank wasn't the most message-disciplined candidate in the history of the world, and so they wanted someone with some gravitas and a good relationship with him who could, really work with him to stay on message and do the right thing during the candidacy. And it was a pretty ironic situation, but Frank was happy to come back from sabbatical. Yes.
Okay, so now let's fast forward to 2005. You're running against Doug Forrester
again.
Yes. I don't even recall whether there was any opposition in the primary to then Senator Corzine.
We collapsed the primary fairly quickly after the governor decided he wanted to run. So we had a very large-scale strategic political infrastructure that very quickly moved to get every 21 county chairs to endorse, as well as the county committees. Dick Cody, who I adore, but knew that we were too formidable, and in essence sort of took a pass. He wasn't happy about it.
No, clearly was not. And now again, to refresh the memories of folks who may not be familiar with exactly what happened at that time, Governor McGreevey resigned. There was no lieutenant governor at that point.
Right.
So the Senate president automatically became the acting governor and actually served in both capacities. Dick Cody was that person.
Yes.
So he was the acting governor from the time that McGreevey resigned, right up to the point where John Corzine ended up being inaugurated.
Yes, and Cody loved it. He loved being governor.
He did enjoy being governor.
He loved it. He called himself the accidental governor. We've had him in class a million times. He really, really enjoyed it. I think one of the realities is there's a lot of folks who would love to be governor. There's not very many who have the resiliency and wherewithal to run a governor's race, right? This is New Jersey. This is brutal, brass-knuckled, intense tactics. And that was evident in John Corzine's race against Doug Forrester. Forrester, first of all, was not a great candidate. He was not a warm and compelling person, right?
And he had won, as I recall, a very a campaign that included a large number of potential Republican candidates.
And he had personal wealth and all of that. But what he did at the end of the campaign, which was pretty terrible. I mean, at the end of the campaign, he ran a horrendously negative ad using Governor Corzine's ex-wife's voice, and it was one of the most from a campaign manager perspective with the governor. it was one of the most emotional things I've ever seen a candidate go through. From a strategic level for Forrester, it was the biggest mistake he ever made. The people of New Jersey did not appreciate him bringing the governor's private life or the divorce into the campaign. They didn't appreciate the sort of the abuse, if you will, of sort of a personal issue and being used tactically like that for a political purpose. And it was a massive mistake. Now, the other reality we had was, you got to remember, in 2005, the governor's background as the former CEO of Goldman was a great asset. In 2009, it was a death knell.
Of course.
But in 2005, you know, we were looking at a massive deficit, potentially as much as $5.5 billion. It later ended up being 3.8, but that's what we thought during the campaign. So the idea that he had the financial acumen, that he had managed a large-scale organization, that he was clearly very successful in his own right, gave him a series of attributes and proof points for the public to say, this is the person I want to run this state, in light of the fact that our economic finances are a complete disaster. So it was a great asset, but obviously in 2009, we couldn't run far enough away from that former title.
It was a great message to send, saying, I can fix the chronic problems that New Jersey has had for the last 30 years,
Yes.
trying to balance its budget because I ran this big corporation. But in fact, it's two entirely different things,
Yes,
isn't it?
no question about it. I would say this, though. I think, you know, the function of this, you know, review of American governors and New Jersey governors is so important, because I think history will write quite well of Governor Corzine's accomplishments, whether it's school construction or school funding formula or, you know, the number of progressive things he did, the protection of children and families, the bringing back the public advocate, the
elimination of the death penalty.
the elimination of the death penalty, civil unions, and being an advocate for same-sex marriage. I think that Governor Corzine and his team, particularly Patty McGuire, was pretty extraordinary. We had some bumps in the road, obviously, that first year with the legislature, but it sort of right-sized itself there. But I think ultimately, in the long run, John Corzine was one of the most responsible, policy-driven governors, and was anxious and willing to take on really big, difficult challenges: affordable housing, the school funding formula. I mean, these are things that had been quagmires in New Jersey politics for decades and decades and decades. Even passing the sales tax initially and trying to commit to actually funding our pension problem, you know, was very unheard of.
Now, there are a lot of people who have, I'll ask you sort of a big picture question before we get into the details. There are a lot of people who have compared Jim Florio's governorship with John Corzine's in the sense that, as you just described, a willingness to take on the really, really difficult issues that have plagued the state for a long time,
That's
and
right.
to do things that may have been unpopular at the time but were perceived as being the right thing to do.
That's exactly right.
Both of them ended up being one-term governors.
Yes.
And is that largely because you can spend your political capital after you've been elected, but if you don't actually bring it back up again, you are vulnerable to being defeated after one term?
Well, I think for John Corzine's particular circumstances, it was quite different, right? I think by the way we had messaged the sales tax was never an issue in his reelection, whereas for Jim Florio, a $2.1 billion, whatever it was, billion-dollar tax increase was the issue as to why Democrats got barred from the state for a series of years. So from a message standpoint, that is not what ended up being, you know, our inability to get reelected. There was a series of other factors. It started in 2008. It started with President Obama and the focus on health care and the Tea Party rising in New Jersey in a way we hadn't seen before. Ocean and Monmouth counties having tremendous amounts of energy and interest in elections.
I think people who remember what 101.5 did to Jim Florio would disagree with that.
Well, I hear you. There's always surges, right? There's waves that come and go. Obviously, the recession was a massive problem for John Corzine, and his previous position at Goldman, as I had said earlier, had now become a death knell for us. And even though we had done all of these progressive things and really had bona fides on these issues, you know, we really lost a lot of ground with that Reagan Democrat voter. In New Jersey, you can lose independents as a Democrat, 1.5 to 1, and still win, but you can't lose them 2 to 1. The Daggett factor was a real factor for us.
We're getting way ahead of ourselves.
So I think there's a lot of reasons why we didn't make it, and ultimately, you know, we started out about 18 points down, and we lost by 3.8%. But it was a grind. It was a real grind.
Sure
that election was a grind.
We will get back to that, but let's go back to 2005.
Sure.
He is elected in November of 2005. At what point did you decide that this time around you would go into state government?
So the very next morning, I think we were at the East Brunswick Hilton. John called me down to his suite. His mother was there. I remember that. She was still alive. He was just really excited. I mean, in particular, because everything got so personal and nasty at the end, I think he was relieved that it was over and really, really excited to become governor. As you may know from speaking to Carl Van Horn and others, the governor had set up this advisory committee of really smart intellects in New Jersey, the Dick Leones, the Carl Van Horns, the Salima Farbers, who really thought deeply about policy. And so he really had a lot in his mind ready to go in terms of what he wanted to sort of
And
come out of the transition
basically
with.
the people who were going to run the transition
Yes.
were already established.
We already had a crew, if you will, and he had already convinced some of the DC folks to move to New Jersey. So Tom Shea, Heather Howard, Julie Cashin, a lot of us had worked together for years, right? So he already had a very loyal and a very committed team, and a very sharp team from a policy perspective and certainly from a political perspective. And so that morning he said to me, we've never discussed this. What do you want to do? And I said, I want to do management. I want to be the chief of management operations.
Really?
Yeah. And he said, you're kidding. And I said, no, I'm not kidding.
No, I guess I'm as surprised to hear that as he was.
Well, he thought I would want to be more political. So he thought I would want to have the job, either sort of a Patty Maguire job where you're dealing with the entire legislature, or Janine LaRue's, which was all the intergovernmental, all the mayors, like the heart and soul of New Jersey, all the constituencies, director of appointments, all of those sorts of things. And my reminder to him was, that I love management. It's one of the things I really, really love doing. I love that I get to do it in my life today. So to me, that was the place where I thought I would really challenge myself, get out of my comfort zone. And we had an understanding that there was a core team of senior folks in his world that were always together on all of the major issues that we had to deal with. There was never... Our front office never had infighting. We never had disloyalty. We never had leaks. We never had... We were a team, and we were a very committed and loyal team to him and to the causes we all thought we were there to fight for.
Was there an Office of Management
Yes.
established at that?
Well,
had there been in the previous administration?
Yes, the previous governor had Diane LaGreedy as the chief of management and operations. What Tom Shea and I did was reframe the governor's office. We had thought in the previous administration there were too many chiefs. And so we wanted more accountability. So we contracted the chiefs. There was only the chief counsel and the chief of staff. Mm-hmm. And everybody else was really a deputy chief, and then there was senior policy, which was Heather. And we wanted that accountability. We wanted to create an environment where we had enough of the folks that would be doing the work rather than too many folks that were serving in the bigger titles. I begged Diane LaGreedy to do a transition with me through the transition and even the first 4 weeks of government. We set up an office where she and I were in the same office for a period of time. I ended up having 3 secretaries for the first 6 weeks because, unfortunately, with the budget deficit, we had some really tough and ugly things to do in the very beginning. We had to terminate and give notice to a series of at-will employees who were Democrats, who worked on the campaign, who worked for Governor Cody. A Democrat to Democrat transition is a unique challenge.
And it never happens in New Jersey.
Yes, I think it's rare in large measure anywhere. But so we wanted to create our own cabinet. We wanted to have our own imprint. The governor had some real ideas about the kinds of folks he wanted to be in. But obviously, we had a cabinet,
Exactly.
right? That Cody had, and we had some very good relationships. I think there were some cabinet members who ultimately were very disappointed when I had to sit with them and tell them that we were not going to ask them to serve.
Why was that your job?
I was going to be the chief of management operations, so this was sort of this is the job, right? So I was I was tremendously in the weeds on the budget, operations, and personnel on the transition. So I set up we had a very robust interview and screening process where we had some really magnificent folks. Ironically, almost like the Dick Cheney sort of story, the governor was very, very fond of Ron Chen and Janine LaRue, and they were on all of our interview committees. And then at some point, Tom Shea and I and the governor had this long talk, and then we sort of begged Ron Chen and Janine to come into government. Right? Janine had no intentions of coming into government at all, and we really arm twisted her. But she really loved working with us on transition, and she fell in love with the governor's agenda. And Ron Chen then became obviously the public advocate. So that process was magnificent. But we brought in folks to these positions of government, whether it was Chris Calori at DOT or Lisa Jackson at DEP, who was an absolute. Lisa was clearly one of the most incredible rock stars of our administration by far.
And she had come from EPA, right?
Yeah, she was at EPA for years, then she was a deputy under Brad Campbell at DEP. She had she has this incredible, she's brilliant, and she's also politically strategic. And so that's really important at DEP. DEP is a really tough department. People tend to say, oh, you're an obstructionist or you're, going to pave over the state. And she was really able to sort of create a pro-growth agenda without ever once compromising our environmental or energy goals. And I remember too, because and I'm jumping ahead, but when the governor had asked me to run his re-election campaign, the deal was Lisa was going to be chief of staff. So I felt very comfortable going to the outside, in running the
She
campaign.
did end up
Lisa,
being chief of staff for about
for
5
about
days
5
or something, right?
seconds, right? And then I remember, I'll never forget, I remember sitting in my office in the government before I had moved over, and she came in and she shut the door, and I said, oh no, because she and I had mapped out a whole strategy for her to become the EPA secretary. I just didn't know it was actually happening, and she said, I just got back from Chicago. And I said, no, you're not doing this to me, Lisa. You're not doing this to me, Lisa. You're supposed to be the chief of staff while I'm running the campaign. But yeah, so we took very seriously the senior staff at each of the departments. I mean, people like Kevin Ryan. I mean, there were some really tremendously talented people in that administration who did really terrific work.
I can't recall offhand, but can you? Who were the folks? How many folks did you actually keep on from the McGreevey/Cody administration?
I can't remember off the top of my head, but I would say it was probably about 40 to 50% of the cabinet and the agency level leadership. So.
That's actually quite high.
Agriculture, DCA.
Well, agriculture is not the governor's.
Well, that's
call.
true. That's true. Although I did get to know that board quite well during that time, because if you do want to make a switch, you have to convince that board, which is a tough, unique.
It's the only
unique
cabinet,
facet.
the only cabinet office in New Jersey that is not a direct appointment of the governor.
Yes. So I would say it was close to 40%, and then, but there were some areas that the governor knew he was going to want to really focus on, right? So he. Human services and health and DEP and DOT were all sort of critical to him. And we had our share of kerfuffles, or whatever you would say. I mean, there was an absolute war in the transition about who should be the AG, and there was a group of us who were fighting with all the strength and passion we could for Zulema Farber to become the Attorney General, and ultimately that's what the governor decided. The most shocking personnel decision of the transition came from the governor himself, which was his choice of Stuart Rabner as chief counsel, which was completely shocking to all of us who had worked with him for years and didn't know who Stuart was. And maybe that's a good thing, because at the time he was prosecuting corruption at the U.S. Attorney's Office, so it's probably a good sign that I didn't know who he was. But the governor had met him at a Thanksgiving meal service in Newark that he would go to with his kids every year, and they'd gotten to know each other quite well. And Stuart was probably the best personnel decision the governor has ever made, maybe in his entire career, including at Goldman. Stuart is a remarkable human being who has he's just a mensch. He's just a magnificent person. And there were so many issues going on with ethics at that time, and corruption, and subpoenas were flying around, in the State House. And, there was this sort of controversy over whether, McGreevey had been under investigation. And so I think the governor really wanted to make sure that his chief counsel had a level of expertise to make sure that we never had any kinds of scandals or problems of that nature, to which we never did, thank God.
Well,
and Stuart was a big part of that.
And despite the fact, I guess, or perhaps because of the fact that you knew going in that you were facing this enormous budget deficit, even in the current year.
Enormous.
Much
Yes.
less than the year.
That's exactly right. We had a shortfall in the existing budget.
That the number one, the first executive order that the governor signed dealt with ethics.
Yes.
Dealt with the ethics of the people who were going to work for him, or
Yes.
who were going to be appointed to various boards and commissions and such.
Yes. And, look, I think there was a lot of pushback, right, about ethics. Governor McGreevey as well had signed an executive order expanding the pay-to-play laws, right? Then Governor Corzine comes in and starts to expand a lot of the ethics rules. And, Stuart was a big part of that. I mean, Stuart really helped us all make sure that we had a guiding compass every morning. That there's a lot of horse trading in Trenton, right? And there are times where you don't know where that line is. It gets a little gray. Things like, for example, completely well-intentioned, I at one point said to an existing mayor, would you like to serve in this position of which I think you're qualified for at DCA? Well, that particular mayor was thinking about running for re-election. And so as we were in a staff meeting and I mentioned it, Stuart said, Maggie, it's illegal to offer somebody a job in return for them not running for office. Now, I had no idea that it would be perceived that way, or that was illegal, by the way. And so, Stuart was just always there to make sure that everything we did was really appropriate. And the governor had, tremendous integrity. So on that front, that was something that was always important to him.
How much of a hands-on role did the governor play in those kinds of conversations?
The governor himself was remarkably engaged. He used to take home, both in the Senate and as governor, I think about this now in light of the present president we have, who doesn't want briefing memos more than a page. He would take home binders on topics and come back the next day with a yellow legal pad, and he loved to have pencil. He always used pencils. I don't know why. And he'd have a million notes in dog-eared corners, and you could tell. And he was a snacker, of course, so it was always like little greasy spots on the binder books as he came back. He loved popcorn and salty snacks, and so he would always have all these marks. And we would literally say to the cabinet, my team, the cabinet affairs team, and the policy team worked really closely together, right? Because we had no money and huge ambition. So what do you do then, right? So you've got every single budget decision was a policy decision, right? So if we wanted to create the Department of Children and Families, how do we justify doing that when we have a $3.6 billion deficit? Well, the governor himself, we would bring in teams of cabinet folks, their senior staff as well as the cabinet member, our cabinet affairs team, the policy teams, and we'd sit with the governor for hours on end and go into the weeds on issues. I mean, he knew that budget by the time we proposed it in a way that I don't think a governor has known a budget in a very long time.
That's a very, very different management style from the ones that I've heard of every other New Jersey governor we've talked about.
He
in terms
loved
of
it.
bringing in the cabinet officer and the sub-cabinet officers
Yes.
to talk specifically
Yes.
about policy initiatives in those areas.
I remember specifically once we did a meeting with Dobie, which is not, the Department of Banking and Insurance, not the most common entity to come into the governor's office, but the governor obviously knew unique things about banking. And we brought in sort of the second and third tier, bureaucratic leadership that had been there for a long time. And I remember one older gentleman saying to me, in my 35 years, this is the first time I've been in the governor's office.
Yeah.
Never met a governor before. And that was really important to us because we really understood that, there's a certain constituency in Trenton that really runs the government. And because we had to terminate so many political appointees, we were going to have to trust the people who actually run the state, that are always there regardless of party affiliation, to really step up and become leaders in our administration, because we were really taking away, because of this budget deficit, an entire layer of people that would be really committed to our agenda. So we knew we had to get deeper, and we had to sort of come up with ways to be creative. And the governor was so adamant in that first budget about doing it differently. Mm-hmm. I mean, he was not going to blink. And if it ruined his political career, he was okay with it.
My experience in the Florio administration, which went through a very similar period of downsizing the government.
It was brutal.
Was that once the word went out about how many people had to be let go in a particular department, there was then this whole bumping scenario that occurred, where
totally true.
What ends up happening is that the last person who came in is the first person who goes out, and everybody who has civil service protection sort of moves back down to the level of civil service protection that they had previously. Is that what went
Absolutely.
on also
and
in this case?
We had. I would say there was two levels to what we had to do. The first was between transition and coming into government. We looked at all the political appointees, and I think we terminated close to 625 people. And as I said, a lot of them were Democrats. A lot of them worked on the campaign. It was really, for me personally, it was really one of the most difficult periods of my professional life ever.
Yet they had to know under the circumstances.
Oh, no.
They had no clue that those positions were likely to be eliminated?
They were always fearful, but they believed that their county chairman could protect them, or somebody else could protect them, or we wouldn't be this responsible once we got into office. We might say we were going to do that during the campaign, but we wouldn't really do it. It's political suicide, right, to fire all these Democrats. Who would do that? And then the second aspect was in the budget, we removed a lot of positions and titles, and that, of course, was difficult because we were very close to our brothers and sisters in the union movement.
Right.
And so our Office of Labor Relations, and this was something that I spent a lot of time on, we had to really sit and spend a lot of time understanding the bumping process, how it would work. Were we negatively impacting a position for forever, or was it just going to be temporary? I mean, there was just so many details and weeds, and it was so complicated.
There were also givebacks that you asked from the unions.
Ironically, when the governor got into his accident, one of the things that ended up happening was our CWA contract was announced a few days, I think the Friday before. We never got any credit for that contract because the entire world was so focused on the governor's health. But there was a ton of givebacks in that contract. It was a very intense negotiation, and one of the most significant things that no one really ever talks about was the governor came up with an idea to cap the pension right at the Social Security benefit, so $98,500, which meant you were going to have your defined benefit program at $98,000 and below. Anything over $98,000, you would go into a potential 401k-like model. What that did was it protected the rank and file and the great, most significant numbers of actually unionized employees, but it took away all the political shenanigans of, working in a job where you can bump up your salary over 3 years at a salary of $350,000, so your pension was 100 and something instead of it being smaller. And so he did some really creative things in that process. But as you know, due to some issues in his personal life and due to the fact that he went to the CWA rally, folks did not have great confidence that he was going to drive a hard bargain. And, it never actually came to be that contract had enough attention that it deserved, because unfortunately, obviously, he had gotten in this horrific accident.
Well, there was a certain amount of money that public employees were now required to contribute
Yes.
to health care, which
Yes.
had not been done previously and so forth. But then the package in terms of raises was fairly generous under the circumstances. So
Yeah.
I think the
We were-
public
yeah, I mean-
perception was that it was kind of a wash.
And by the way, think about that. That's really John Corzine's nature, right? He really does believe that so for example, on the budget, we weren't just saying, you have to increase the sales tax, right? We were making massive cuts, massive
it was a
and
lot more
deep
than that.
and vicious, brutal, and for us, painstaking cuts to programs we really cared about. So, I think John was always a man of compromise. He would not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and if he could advance the ball, move it down the field, he absolutely would.
Now let's talk about that budget battle the first year.
Oh, boy.
Because that was it ended up with the first shutdown in
Yes.
New Jersey history.
Yes.
Because the Democratic governor could not get the Democratic legislature, in particular the Democratic Assembly,
Yes.
to approve a budget, and there was a clear. I think you describe it in two different ways. One was that there was a clear attempt by the legislature to demonstrate itself as a co-equal branch of
Yes.
government. And I think every incoming governor faces a certain amount of that.
Yes.
But it also seems to me that there was also a very distinct north-south split that was taking place at that point, and that in fact may be resurrecting itself in the current administration.
Yeah.
Do you think that those were the two dominant factors that caused the state shutdown?
I think Governor Christie has told this story publicly before, so I don't think I'm repeating anything out of school. He used to tell a story about while he was on the campaign trail at the end that Governor Kane said to him, somebody had been giving him advice about the legislature, and Governor Kane didn't agree with that person's recommendation. Governor Kane pulled him aside and said, you have to have one of the two, meaning you have to be close to either the Speaker or the Senate President. If you're not close and you don't have one of the houses, you're going to just get demolished, right? That's what he said to Christie. Now, interestingly enough, that's a Republican with a Democrat legislature, but that's what Tom Kaine went through as well.
Yes, indeed.
And Tom Kaine's recommendation was the Senate President is the preferred partner because there's so much more authority as it relates to the Senate powers. John Corzine had a tough road to hoe because Dick Cody had been the accidental governor and really still wanted to be governor. So even though they were aligned on issues, there was a natural sort of friction there that I think that Cody really felt like he had been robbed of an opportunity because of Corzine's personal wealth and his ability to run for governor. Joe Roberts came from the South, obviously. The South has tremendous discipline in the legislature. Joe Roberts was very well regarded by the Assembly Democratic rank and file members. And so as a result, Corzine did not necessarily have a foothold with leadership in either house. The other reality is if you have all Democrats, it means that the legislature's only ability to contrast itself as far as it relates to the public's domain is to contrast itself with the governor's policies, which we saw a series of folks do. Whether Barbara Buono did it to Governor Corzine on pension and benefits reform or others, that was constant. So I think that was a huge factor. However, I will say that Patty McGuire and Joe Cryan, who was then the state chairman but a member of the Assembly, had probably just did some of the most strategic, brilliant political work I've ever seen. I mean, one of the unknown facts about that time was how closely we were working with the Republicans. So one of the realities was the Assembly Democrats couldn't get their version of the budget bill out of their own budget committee because we had the Republicans with us. And they had decided that they didn't want to participate in sort of what was happening here. And so those Republicans were very helpful to us. Bill Gormley.
I was going to say, who were the key Republicans?
Frank Lee, Joe Malone, Allison McHose, Bill Baroni. There was a whole cadre of Republicans. And then there was another aspect to our strategy that Tom Shea and I sort of ran point on, which was, we have to make sure that the public really understands what's happening here, right? And even if they may not like a sales tax increase, they have to understand that they finally have a governor for once who's going to look them in the eye and tell them the truth and do the right thing. Because you got to remember, we had all this corruption, we had a governor resign, we had all of the, we had to sort of create stability again in Trenton. And the people of New Jersey don't trust Trenton, right? They still don't till today, right? So your governor has a better shot. I mean, John Corzine was more popular after the sales tax than he was before, which is ironic, and most people don't really realize that. And I think it's because of leadership traits. 2 weeks before the budget shutdown, folks didn't think a sales tax was necessary. 2 weeks after, they did. And we ran a
Well,
very...
it helps if you shut down the state parks
Well,
and you shut down the casinos.
And that's what we needed, right? We needed leverage. And we needed leverage to show the legislature that we weren't going to blink. We understood that they were going to test a new governor. I think they underestimated the governor's wherewithal. I think we had the mantra of the bully pulpit, which is super helpful. The governor called an emergency session every morning and gave a speech. Those speeches were ironically usually written by Stu Ravner, which was funny because it was not necessarily the skill set that he thought he was bringing to the job, but he just has such a unique sense of life and fairness that he was just had a really compelling voice. The governor himself was deeply involved in the machinations of the budget and knew it cold, so every time a legislator would come in with a gimmick or a one-shot or an idea, he was able to say, I'm sorry, nope, no go. It was a really rough time, though, because a lot of members of the legislature that had been a huge part of the campaign and were very close to the governor and to me and to Patty and to Janine had to pick sides. And if you were in the legislature, you were really supposed to pick the speaker's side, especially in the assembly. So,
If you want your bills to be posted.
right, exactly right. Whereas the Republicans understood it's better for them to be closer to the governor than the speaker because they're never going to get anything from the speaker. So if they're close to us, we might be able to help them with their local priorities. And so it was a really tough time. And people I was very, very close to, Bonnie Watson-Coleman, Nellie Poe, were siding with their speaker. And then Joe Cryan had a different group that was with us. And then we kind of were able to mix up the Senate pretty good because Cody wasn't going to go along with the South's budget. And so it was a complicated time. It was an emotional time. We were all exhausted. We were sleeping at the State House, most of us, not everybody. I was, certainly because of the operational role. We had a hotline available for every single institution in the state because we were worried that during the shutdown somebody would get hurt or there'd be a public safety issue. We wanted to be prepared. So Stu Ravner and I had a whole process of how we were handling that. And we had somebody on duty all the time, 24/7 through the night, to make sure that if this phone rang, we were there to give an answer, provide counsel to anybody who might have needed it. We did all of the optical stuff, like rolling the cot into the governor's office and, making sure the TV cameras got that kind of stuff. We alluded to the fact that we were going to run TV ads, although some of the unions were already running TV ads. It was a really difficult time. But this is what I mean about the governor. He is ambitious in a good way, but he's also a huge risk taker, and he will play at the highest levels of risk if he thinks it's worth it on the other side of it. And he really did a beautiful job during that time.
Well, certainly in reviewing the 4 budgets, I guess, that he proposed, the first one was contentious. It caused the shutdown. Ultimately, I guess after, 5 or 6 days, finally there was a compromise reached and a bill was passed and he signed it. The subsequent 3 budgets had very, very little attention paid to them. And I was surprised to read that in retrospect. That
nobody wanted to go through it again. Nobody wanted to go through it again. And to be honest, it took us some time to heal as a party, right? Because there was some lingering anger and tension. And so, one of the things I think the governor and Patty were very good at was thinking through from the legislator's perspective. Like Speaker Roberts was very focused on housing. And so one of the things that the governor and the speaker started to work on was housing together, to try to find a way to sort of bring the party back together, if you will, and to sort of mend the fences. I think the other thing it did is reminded folks about the power of the New Jersey governorship, right? Mm-hmm. This is the New Jersey governorship, right? It's live by the sword, die by the sword, right? And so even though it's a co-equal branch of government and the legislature wants to show their power, the governor has inherently much, much more power. And so if you're the legislature, you don't want to go down this road again because the governor shut the government down for 6 days and increased taxes by $1 billion, and his numbers went up, not down in the polls.
Mm-hmm. And the 1947 Constitution absolutely places that power on the governor of New Jersey.
No question. And don't forget there was tension because the legislators had put a ton of Christmas tree stuff in there and the governor had to veto all that on the day that he signed the budget. So then that made legislators feel as if, we made agreements that were in bad faith or, things of that nature. And it was just a very complicated time. And then obviously something that people don't focus on is after the governor's accident, we really lost time. Yeah. We lost a big chunk of really critical time, I think, in the governorship, and that was also a super difficult time.
We'll get there in just a moment.
Okay.
One other area I want to touch on is the governor's big picture plans.
Yes.
I would say, in particular, the asset monetization.
Oh, yeah.
A subject that I still, even after interviewing Brad Abelow at some
Who's one of the most brilliant people you're ever going to meet, by the way.
I'm still not entirely sure how that would all work.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how someone in your position at that point,
Yes.
who didn't have a financial
Background.
how did you explain to me what you think it meant and how it was all going to work?
Well, what I remember, the first thing I remember is sitting in a meeting in Brad Abelou's office with, I think, the McKinsey folks, and they had these bubble charts and this regression analysis. And I remember thinking to myself, it was funny when Corzine was in the U.S. Senate, I came back to Rutgers and did a mini MBA because I felt inadequate on the sort of financial details of the world because the governor was so involved in that. And so I thought to myself, well, I'll be able to sit through these meetings. It'll be a piece of cake. You know, sometimes folks have a tendency to make things much more complicated than they are, right? In essence, he wanted to monetize a public benefit corporation to be able to finance the roadways, bridges, and tunnels in New Jersey for 75 years. The problem with any big picture idea of this nature is that whenever you have a 75-year plan, you can cost it. And once you can cost it,
Everybody looks at what it's going to be the
that's
75th
exactly
year.
right. So I think it was Tom Kean Jr., if I'm not mistaken. It might have been somebody else, but I think it was Tom Kean Jr. who said he wants to increase by 800%, right, the tolls in this state, et cetera, et cetera. And that was when it was over. I mean, strategically, we had actually spent a lot of time thinking about this, right? But John Corzine would not micromanage a product. And what I mean by that is the town halls. We could have easily said to all of the building trade unions, please pack them and make sure that this is great. Instead of doing 21 of them, as some of us had advised, let's just do a north, central, and south. I remember a particular governor saying to our governor off the record, this kind of thing, something this ambitious and this big, do in the darkness of night with no transparency and lame duck. Don't ever do what you're doing because this is way too much transparency and it will die of its own weight. To the point where after asset monetization, failed, he increased the tolls on the turnpike and nobody batted an eye. And then launched one of the largest capital construction budgets the New Jersey Turnpike's ever seen, which was super helpful, I think, to members of the building trades while the recession was ongoing. And no one blinked an eye because it was the traditional process that everybody said. You put a number out, you did a smaller number. So sometimes in politics, when you think big and really significantly, there's a huge danger that it could fail, and in that case it did. And then unfortunately, in the re-elect, the governor mentioned it again 2 weeks out from Election Day, to the shock and dismay of so many of us, because he stood in those town halls and just got murdered.
Reminding people of his greatest failure.
Yeah, and it was because he was always so enamored by the idea. Mm-hmm. He just loved the idea. But sometimes what you love in a certain setting, maybe as a CEO of Goldman, is not necessarily how the public's going to react to it, and the public was not reacting well to it.
It raises a question. I mean, you're saying that he raised an issue in the last couple of weeks of the campaign.
He did.
That he shouldn't have.
Yeah.
And it makes one wonder how. I mean, obviously he's a very affable person. You describe him as being a very, very effective manager. You describe him as having a very good big picture ideas. How good of a campaigner was he?
So, if you had John Corzine on a one-on-one, right, he loves people. So he vests in them, he connects with them, and he's got like a very good Midwestern way about him. But he doesn't have like the Jersey, New York killer instinct. It's just not him, right? He was raised in Wiley Station, Illinois, and the world he was raised in is very different than the New Jersey politics world. So I think he's not a cutthroat guy. I mean, this is a really honorable man. I remember in the 2009 campaign, we had an opportunity in the Republican primary potentially where Steve Lonegan was actually neck and neck with Chris Christie. And if Steve Lonegan had come out of that primary, we probably would have won that election. And we had talked about, as an operative, I had said to him, let's try to find some ways to help Lonegan win this primary. And he thought that was so inappropriate to be involved in the other party's primary. I mean, just dirty tactics, I'm not going to do it, right? And we all said, ugh. The second sort of political mistake, but driven by how honorable he is he would not contrast the record with Chris Daggett. So we had a third-party candidate in the 2009 election. By all accounts, everyone thought initially that Chris Daggett was going to hurt the Chris Christie candidacy more than the John Corzine candidacy.
Daggett had been in Tom Kane's administration as a
Republican leader
of environmental protection.
Yes, honorable guy, smart guy, talking about real policies, actually talking about raising the gas tax and a series of other things. And what the Republican Governors Association did ads, 15-second ads, was actually quite brilliant, that put Corzine and Daggett together. And so instead of bleeding votes from the Republicans, he was bleeding our votes and bleeding away independent women, which was a real problem for us. And so we raised this with Corzine, and we were clear with him that, Governor, like we gotta cut this guy down. If we don't cut him down, it's a real problem. And he would not do that. He just didn't think it was appropriate. He thought Chris Daggett was an honorable guy. And, I think John Corzine wanted to put his head on a pillow at night and not behave in a way that some New Jersey politicians were quite comfortable behaving in a certain kind of way.
Let's move back to the accident.
Yes. Horrible.
I mean, you can just put it in quotes, the accident.
Yeah.
And anybody who was involved in the Corzine administration knows exactly what you're talking about.
Yes.
Tell us about how government functioned. Were you the chief of staff at this point?
No, Tom Shea was still the chief of staff. I was deputy chief of staff. For me, in my role in sort of management operations, it was immediately problematic on so many levels. Dick Cody, though, obviously had been an acting governor, I guess, and so he jumped at the chance to come in and help.
A lot of people said he really, really stepped up under the circumstances,
He absolutely
given the
did.
fact that there had been such tension between him and the governor.
Oh, he put the state first without question, and the second that Tom called him, he was in the office the next day and sat down with all of us and said, "Tell me what's going on, how can I help? Where do we need to work together?" And the truth is that John Corzine, I think, at least from a press perspective, was really in really, really bad shape, probably worse than anybody recognized in the first sort of 48 hours after the accident. I mean, John Corzine is he's a Marine. He's a very formidable guy. He's a strong guy. He's a runner.
Yeah, but it was a horrific accident.
It was like 72 bones, every single rib. He broke his sternum. I mean,
and he was in critical condition.
Yes, and I remember when I first saw him, and I'm not an overly emotional person, but you couldn't help but cry. I mean, I had worked for him for years, obviously, by that point, and it was stunning what shape he was in.
When did you see him?
I saw him at the end of his time at Cooper Hospital. Only Tom had been there consistently throughout, and I think I was the only other staff member who went down, while he was in the hospital. And then we did a greeting with him when he got back to Drumthwacket, and we really operated the government out of Drumthwacket for probably, I would say, close to 3 or 4 months. His physical recovery and therapy was very, very intense, and he's such an energetic guy and so committed that I remember it was actually kind of awkward because he would have these guys, they would be stretching him and doing all these things with him, and he'd be moaning in pain, but he'd still want us to be briefing him on a topic. And I was like, this is like nutty. Like, come on, you need to like focus on this recovery. But this is a guy who didn't fear work, and he wasn't going to not do his job just because he happened to be in unbelievable pain, and he was in unbelievable pain for quite some time. I mean, I think a lesser people would not be able to continue being governor and being in that kind of pain.
Yeah. Let's talk about the 2009 campaign. You mentioned the mistake, in your judgment, of not going after Chris Daggett or not getting Steve Lonergan over the top.
Yep.
But obviously, the what happened to the Great Recession was not something that benefited the re-election campaign of John Corzine.
It was devastating. I mean, the amount of loss of confidence of particular segments of the voting population that were really critical for us was really problematic. One of the most early things we did we brought Barack Obama into PNC Bank Arts Center, and one of the reasons we did that was we needed to get the Democratic base back. So we weren't just bleeding out independents at the time. We were bleeding out Democrats.
And you knew this from polls.
Yes, and Joe Biden came in. I feel like he came in about 10 or 15 times throughout that 2009 race. One, because Joe and John had a great relation for the Senate, but also because we just really needed some star power to sort of really try to reconfigure this. And the president was unbelievably supportive and helpful. His team was on the phone with us. I mean, Patrick Gaspard and Karine Jean-Pierre. Almost daily. This was really critical to them, this race, because obviously it's an arbiter of his presidency in the off-year cycle with us in Virginia. The governor had committed to a certain number he was going to spend, and he wasn't going to spend more than that. And he was serious about it, although people didn't think he was, but he was, and he kept to that number.
You had left the administration.
I had left the administration and was managing the campaign. And we had some political fallout. There were people who thought that Corzine was vulnerable. There were some Democrats who certainly helped the Christie candidacy. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The first phone call Christie got as a congratulations call was from a very prominent New Jersey Democratic Party boss who called him to say, "You're going to win tonight. Congratulations," at about 10 minutes after the polls closed. We also had a data problem during that campaign. We did not predict the appropriate turnout sample. One of the things that happened, this was the first year that Mike Duham and I taught our class here at Rutgers, took over for Roger Bodman and Harold Hodis. So we did a debrief after.
And Mike Duham was running.
And Mike Duham was running Christie's, and every Tuesday night these students got to see a pretty magnificent show between the two of us. Mike used to joke around. He used to wonder if you're going to look really exhausted and tired, and think that was a good sign, that maybe you were a mess and the campaign was a mess. It was just a rocky road because we started out as such a deficit. And the other reality that people don't really talk about anymore is that August, right, 20 some odd Democrats were indicted, which is a morning I will never forget. That morning, Tom Shea and I we had heard rumors and rumblings of this, and we drove to the governor's apartment in Hoboken, and we were sitting there watching the television, just the way most New Jerseyans were, of this undercover rabbi bribing and selling animals, and we're watching a Democrat after a Democrat after a Democrat, somebody in our cabinet, their home was raided.
Although that came to nothing.
Yes, and that was a horrendous abuse of power. And so, you couldn't have had more tough tours of duty during that campaign, and it was really unfortunate. And then, when you lose by 3.8%, that's tough. That's hard to get over.
Mm-hmm. How did you get over it?
It's funny. I think I was so exhausted just from it felt like a sprint from the time he decided to run for governor and just serving, and then the campaign. So that,
well, for you, there's a sprint here from about what, 1992 or so.
Yeah, 1996 straight through to then was just a really crazy time.
That must have been an absolute shock to you that you've had a career now that's gone on for 15 years or something like that, and boom.
And your phone stops ringing, and the world changes dramatically, and your relevance to the world changes dramatically. What I did initially was just laid on the floor in my living room and played with my kids because I hadn't seen them in a series of months. There's a lot of sacrifice that obviously goes into this for all the people that serve governors and senators, and certainly the candidates themselves and the office holders themselves. So that was the first thing I did, and then I had to sort of think about what I wanted to do next. And I remember a series of people coming to me and saying, "Well, whatever you do, remember that whether it's a Republican or a Democrat that runs the state, there's about 400 or 500 people that really matter in the state. All of them, and they're all a phone call away from you. So don't underestimate, what you've learned and what context that is." Mm-hmm. I was never going to go back into government after the Corzine election, mm-hmm. but I didn't have a plan. I was a very loyal soldier. I was not focused on myself. I was really focused on seeing him succeed. So. That was a really tough time. And
as someone who has done adjunct professing, one is not able to live on that kind of a salary.
That's true. That's true.
So where did you end up? What did you do?
It was very ironic. Bob Franks, God rest his soul, the former congressman in New Jersey, had set me up to do two drastically different options. Came to me very quickly. That I wasn't interested in. One was a lobbying gig, and I wasn't really a big fan of doing that. And the other was another campaign, and I was like, no, there's no way I'm doing that. So what I did was I started talking to sort of a larger group of people about what I might want to do. And I got a job offer to be a chief of staff for a pharmaceutical CEO, and Bob Franks back then ran the Healthcare Institute. Right. Mm-hmm. And then Bob Franks called me back and said, "I need to see you." This was like a week later when I was seriously considering it. At the same time, I had a parallel track where the International Vice President of the Laborers Union, Ray Pacino, who had been a mentor of mine, asked me to come and work for the union doing business development, finding real estate projects for them to invest their pension money in, which I thought was kind of intriguing, actually. Mm-hmm. And so I sat with Bob for lunch, and he said, I have to tell you this or else I'm going to regret it. And I said, "What?" And he said, "You can't go work for that guy." I said, "Why?" He said, "He's awful. Everybody works for him. Yeah, you make money, but you're going to get divorced. You're never going to see your kids. Don't do it." And then I talked to him about Ray Pacino's offer, so I went to work for Ray. And when I went to work for Ray, he had been an admirer and supporter of Andrew Cuomo's, and Andrew Cuomo was running for governor in 2010. And even though I had promised my husband I would never do a campaign again, and promised to everybody on the planet I was done with politics, I went on loan from Ray and worked on Cuomo's 2010 campaign, and then came back to the Laborers, and then 2 years later, I opened up my own public affairs firm.
Ah, okay. And tell us about that. What does that do?
So it's exciting. The firm's called Kivit. It's got 5 offices across the country: Miami, New York, New Jersey, Chicago, and DC. It's a former David Axelrod firm. When David was doing what's called AKPD, his political work for candidates like Barack Obama, he had a sidebar firm that did public affairs, so the intersection of business, government, politics, communicating something to the public on a touchy issue so that you can get the legislative body or whomever to move, right? So nowadays you're dealing with disruptors, whether it's the Airbnbs or the Googles, and then, then there's responsible disruption and irresponsible disruption. So it's a team of about 75 folks. My partner, Eric Sedler, ran this company called ASGK for Axelrod, and then when Axelrod went into the White House, Eric ran it. I had hired Eric's firm to do some commercials for an independent expenditure for Governor Cuomo in New York, and then he asked me to open up their office. I decided to open up my own, and then 2 years later, we actually merged the Chicago and the New York firms and created Kivit. Mm-hmm. So it's exciting. We get to do everything from, right now we work on sort of the closed Rikers and criminal justice reform type movement, which is great, to existing stuff that you would know, like brand reputation, for Anheuser-Busch or, crisis communications and things of that nature. So we still get enough campaigns where we get to do issue advocacy and ballot campaigns and things like that, not political candidates directly.
Although you did do
I went on leave this
okay.
year to run Governor Cuomo's campaign because he's a personal friend, and it was just a weird, volatile time, and I think he wanted to have somebody who had some wisdom, because now I'm like the older one in the room these days. I used to be always the youngest one in the room.
Was there ever any doubt that he would win?
I don't think there was a doubt about how he would win. I think the question was by how much and if he could continue to still move the state forward. And what I mean by that is...
well, he got the Senate.
Yes, well, I mean, he won 8 seats in the
years.
Senate, and 3 congressional. So we had an extraordinary night. We elected the first ever African-American woman Attorney General, Tish James, who's extraordinary, re-elected his lieutenant governor. We played a very, very big role in all of those collective races across the board. But I think in the primary, the issue really was, a fight that the Democratic Party is having now, right? Where is democratic socialism? How does it fit within the Democratic Party or not? Mm-hmm. And what kind of Democrat are we? And
the mayoralty race reflected that, certainly.
Yes. So I think with Cynthia Nixon and Zephyr Teachout, a lot of folks were really concerned that New York was going to go, so far to the left that it was going to become more of a democratic socialist state than a Democrat state. But we were able to avoid that really by nationalizing the election and really making this about the fact that this was really Trump v. Cuomo.
Well, you ran against Cuomo. You ran against Trump.
We did.
Yeah.
And the attributes that Governor Cuomo had in 2014 that were sometimes problematic for him, that he could be aggressive, some would say that sometimes he can be a bully, were now positive attributes in light of this president. They wanted somebody really strong and tough and tenacious to fight Trump, and they weren't focused on the primary in New York. They were focused on, how do you not separate immigrant families and kids from one another, and how do you make sure you have gun laws, and how do you make sure you have Roe v. Wade protected. They were worried about these threats emanating from Trump and Washington. Democrats were. They were not as focused. And Cuomo has a remarkable record. I mean, he's a remarkably accomplished governor in terms of the progressive agenda that he's passed, as well as how well his state's doing economically.
How much of it was a little inside baseball here? How much of a decision to in the ads that we saw on the New York television stations, much of it was Cuomo attacking Trump directly. How much of that is just what he wanted to do, or how much of it is poll-driven and focus group tested?
Well, it's interesting. It's a combination, I would say, but the immigration, the first ad we put up, was not tested at all. So that's very unusual if you're going to spend $30 million. You do ad testing, right? You do it qualitative, quantitative, you do the whole 9 yards. But that moment in time where he took on the president on the separation of families was just a very significant moment for Democrats. And so we did an in-house ad. A gentleman by the name of Max, who worked on the campaign staff, did the first ad. It was a Statue of Liberty with the governor's, that sort of iconic Cuomo voice over top of it, saying, what do we stand for? This is the lady in the harbor who's supposed to protect us, and look at what's happening. So the real beginning of the nationalizing of the campaign was done purely on instinct and on gut and on the fact that we just all felt like the president had just gone way too far. Mm-hmm. And then right after that, the president did Kavanaugh. And so, boom, now you just rolled right into Roe v. Wade, right? And so, running campaigns today is a very different thing than it used to be. It used to be that you would really have it mapped out. You knew your greatest strengths and weaknesses. You knew how you were inoculating your weaknesses and how you were going to really make sure people were educated on your strengths. With Donald Trump, if you're a Democrat in a blue state, you have to watch what he's doing. He's changing the whole nature of political communications in one tweet, every night at 9 o'clock and every morning at 5 a.m. And so That campaign, Donald Trump really wrote that campaign more than anybody.
Will you be running Andrew Cuomo's presidential campaign?
I don't.
2020?
I'll tell you. Commuting from New Jersey into the city to run a governor's race while you have 3 children it was a brutal time. And Governor Cuomo is talk about in the weeds. Governor Cuomo is a brilliant guy and used to be an operative, right? Ran his father's campaigns. So this is a guy who knows a lot about polling and field and politics. And so, if you want to work for Andrew Cuomo, you better be ready, because you got to cross every T and dot every I.
And you're not about to say right now whether you're going to be ready in 2020.
I have no interest in running a presidential race, not with the firm and my children and everything else. But obviously, if I can't wait to find which candidate we're going to have. I think we're going to have a very, very messy primary as Democrats, but I will certainly volunteer time for anybody who's going to be running against this president.
Getting back to John Corzine for just one final set of questions. Just thinking now in retrospect about his governorship, principally, what would you say were his greatest accomplishments, and what would you say were your greatest disappointments?
Interesting. His greatest accomplishments, I think, all had to do with the fact that John has this really incredible combination of integrity and humility that I think is fairly rare in politicians these days. And because of that, he had just a really unique, genuine commitment to sort of serving things out. So, for example, when the Department of Children and Families came up and he wanted Kevin Ryan to run it, it wasn't just that he put Kevin Ryan in charge of it and just sort of walked away. It was the things that people didn't see, right? How there was a monthly check-in for the first 2 years to see how we were progressing, and how, knock on wood, we didn't have circumstances of children having horrible situations like they did under Governor McGreevy's time, and kids dying.
Well, DYFUS dating way back long before Governor
had
McGreevy.
real problems, right? I think the school funding formula, I know people talk about refreshing it now, but I think that was a remarkable effort. Just an incredibly complicated, brutal effort. I think the governor,
as Carl Van Horn describes it, an ever-changing situation.
I think his efforts on affordable housing, I think his efforts on increasing the number of folks that were in the New Jersey Family Care Program were remarkable. His commitment to Planned Parenthood, abolishing the death penalty, which I think in retrospect now seems so easy, but was not at all easy. His advocacy for same-sex marriage, his advocacy for the gas tax at one point. I mean, this is, I gave John Corzine 7 years of my professional life, and I don't regret a day of it. I think he's a very, very honorable guy, and I really did have a strategy for myself in politics to work for folks that had personal wealth. Not because I think that politics is just for the rich at all, but I think it gives a certain level of independence in a state that is heavily dominated by party leaders, and so it gives you a certain level of independence to pursue all the issues that you care about for the right reasons, without sort of looking over your shoulder all the time at the political establishment.
And the disappointments?
The disappointments, I mean, same-sex marriage was a real disappointment, I think, for us, in the sense that in Lame Duck, when the governor lost, we really thought we could do something about it. I think the governor, I think the governor not getting a gas tax done was really, really unfortunate. I had been a part of so many administrations that promised a gas tax, from Jim McGreevy to Cody to Corzine, and I thought that was sort of unfinished business for us, because he was such an advocate for infrastructure and transit, and after asset monetization, we weren't touching it. We just weren't going to touch it. He was interested in doing it in lame duck, but the legislature was not. So they were like, we're going to have this governor come in. They're going to beat us up over it. And disappointments. And
then kill the tunnel.
Right. Strategically, we should have gone negative on Chris Daggett, and we should have found a way to be helpful in that primary to see if Steve Lonegan could have won, because then he probably would have been a two-termer.
Well, anything else I should have asked you that I didn't?
No, I don't think so. I think it's a great process, because I don't think Governor Corzine's ever got a fair or appropriate review of his record or commitment, and I think so much the money and things of that nature overshadowed I think some of the impact he had on the state, which I think was pretty significant. I think his heart was always in the right place, so I think it's great you're doing this.
Well, you've certainly provided us with a very thorough review of both his time in the Senate and his time as governor, and we thank you very much for sitting down and doing that.
Absolutely.